Welcome, everyone, to Red Planet Live. I am your host, Ashton Zeth, and I'm elated to be hosting the Mars Society's podcast and leading the conversation about human exploration of the universe and the future settlement of Mars. As a longtime space enthusiast, I am passionate about STEM education and making humanity an interplanetary species. Thank you, everyone, for joining today and supporting Red Planet Live. Now, as usual, before we kick off the conversation with today's guest, just want to share a quick Mars Society reminder. The Mars Society is proud to announce that Sergei Yakimov has completed his mission with Hera. Sergei is the director of the Mars Desert Research Station and has successfully completed a 45-day NASA-simulated Mars mission at the Human Exploration Research Analog Facility located at Johnson Space Center in Houston. The mission, which ran from August 9th to September 23rd, is a vital part of NASA's efforts to better understand the physical and psychological challenges astronauts may face during long-duration space missions. So everybody, welcome home. Sergei, we're excited to see you represent the Mars Society on that mission. All right, for today, want to quickly introduce our special guest. I'm excited to introduce our guest today and speak to the man who has authored my current read called Reentry. Eric Berger is a senior space editor at Ars to wonky space policy books, including Liftoff, about the rise of SpaceX, and Reentry on the development of the Falcon 9 rocket and Dragon. Eric has an astronomy degree from the University of Texas and a master's in journalism from the University of Missouri. He previously worked at the Houston Chronicle for 17 years, where the paper was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2009 for his coverage of Hurricane Ike. He is a certified meteorologist and has founded two weather monitoring websites, including Space City Weather and the iWall, and currently lives in Houston. Eric, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Ashton. A pleasure to talk to you.
Excited for today's conversation, and like normal, we're going to kick off the conversation with a segment that we call Question of the Day. It's no right or wrong answer. It's just meant to be an icebreaker, just to kick off the fun questions you're going to get today. And so this question is inspired by you being an author. So today's question is, what was your favorite book as a child?
Has to be Lord of the Rings trilogy by Tolkien. I read The Hobbit and those books when I was a kid, and boy, that really set me off on a wild journey through Middle Earth. So I would have to say those books were really very, very influential on me.
I love it. No hesitation there. Do you still have copies of those? Do you keep them around for a light read when you're trying to feel inspired again?
Multiple copies. Now I haven't read them in the last 5 years, but yeah, I've probably read each of the books 3 or 4 times.
I love it. Okay. Would you ever dabble in the fantasy genre?
No, I can't write dialogue to save my life. So it's strictly nonfiction for me.
All right. Well, you're doing a great job there. So, stick with what you know. I would say for myself, I loved Harry Potter as a kid. Still love Harry Potter. I mean, it's the spooky season, so I'm going through the movies again just to start to get into the festive spirit. So yeah, I loved Harry Potter as a kid. So I would say those ones were some of my favorite as a child. And I see we've got a couple responses already. I love that we've got a mixture of some space books, some fantasy books as well. But I want to remind everybody as we're jumping into the conversation with Eric, if you have a question, if you've got a comment, please put those in the chat. I will try to sprinkle those in throughout the hour. So Eric, I want to start the conversation always at the beginning, like we normally do. So if you could tell us just a little bit about your background. Did you always want to be a writer? Did you envision yourself writing about the space industry when you were younger?
I was always interested in space and stars, and so I actually went to the University of Texas to study astronomy, and got into that and really did all right, but realized it was basically all physics and math. And so I graduated with an astronomy degree and decided that, instead of trying to study a particular class of stars the rest of my life, I maybe would write about science instead of doing science. And so I went on with the intent of becoming a science journalist. And that's what I did at the Houston Chronicle for a number of years. And then in 2003, we had the Space Shuttle Columbia tragedy, which I was living in Houston at the time. It was a huge deal, and I was pulled in to help cover that for the Chronicle. And I started writing more and more about space, but it really didn't capture me because it was a lot of the same kinds of missions with the Space Shuttle going to space for a couple of weeks, typically the International Space Station, and coming back. And it was, look, it's a great vehicle, great people, but the missions were kind of all similar.
Mm-hmm.
And not particularly exciting to me. And I didn't get really excited about space until the early 2010s, when SpaceX was starting to do interesting things, the commercial space industry was growing. And as a contrast to that of what NASA was doing with the quote journey to Mars, which, always felt like a Potemkin village to me, not really
Mm-hmm.
a real mission at all. And the large contracts being given out for the Space Launch System and Orion spacecraft. And I contrasted that with what sort of the promise of commercial space industry. And that's when I got really excited writing about private companies and kind of the energy and entrepreneurial spirit they were bringing to spaceflight. And
Mm-hmm.
so, for about the last decade, that's primarily what I've been doing is writing about space. And I was just super fortunate to have the opportunity to write about SpaceX, which is clearly the most important story in space over the last 10 or 15 years. I would say of the century, the rise of SpaceX is probably the most important story in spaceflight. So to be in a position to talk to all of the early employees and be able to tell their story was really a privilege. And I feel like, just as I say, it's a real privilege to be able to bring that story to a wider audience.
Mm-hmm. You bring up a good point. You said, speak with those employees. So, I'm sure everybody at some point thought, hey, I want to be a writer. They're enjoying reading books and they're saying, hey, maybe I want to do this. So from a writer to those that are listening, when you're preparing to write a book like Liftoff or Reentry, how do you tackle that task? Where do you start? How do you gather the stats? How do you conduct all those interviews? How do you pull all that information together to create a book like you've written?
Well, I had never written a book before Liftoff, so it was a challenge. But really, you just got to kind of dive in. Um, and the most important things about writing a book, I think, are first of all, you have to be able to write, which you can learn to do over time with practice. But the second thing is you have to be really passionate about your subject, because if you have to write 100,000 words about something you're not interested in, that's going to be pure torture.
Yeah.
But if you're writing 100,000 words about something that you're really interested in, then that really gives you the motivation every day to go at it and go to work. And obviously, I was super interested to really learn the early history of SpaceX, and going into liftoff. And so I just started out by talking to as many people as I could, gathering as much information, and then came around on the other side of that and tried to organize it into a coherent narrative.
Mm-hmm. And with trying to get all of those interviews, was that a difficult task to get those individuals to agree to speak with you to share their stories, or were they pretty open to having those conversations?
Well, for liftoff, it was fortuitous because it was in the 2017 timeframe,
Mhm.
and I approached Elon and asked him. I felt like I told him I thought that it would be important to tell the story of SpaceX's origin, and so he agreed to talk to me. He agreed to allow current employees at SpaceX to talk to me, and really that was the key to getting former SpaceX employees to talk to me. And so,
Mhm.
the key was sort of getting some buy-in from Elon in the sense that he was interested in the project and open to it, and then really developing relationships with the earliest employees, Tom Muller's, Tim Buzza, Hans Koenigsmann's,
Mhm.
and Chris Thompson, because then they were kind of the gatekeepers to their teams, right? So who were the key engineers that worked for you, and can you help me put me in touch with them? And that just really opened all those doors.
Mhm. It's exciting to hear those conversations. There was a comment about like the dog not scared. I loved that anecdote. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to use that. I'm gonna incorporate that. When I'm feeling a little bit nervous about something up, I'm gonna have to say that to myself to remind myself, like, hey, if they can do it, I can tackle whatever this trivial, non-important thing is. But you touched on a little bit, and for those that don't know, I mean, on the podcast we have a variety of listeners, those that are in the space industry, they're technical, and those that are not, and they want to learn about what's happening in space. So, your two books are focusing on SpaceX and its journey to becoming the leader that it is in the space industry right now. So, what about this organization drew you to it, and is the reason that you wrote these two books about it?
Well, I think it was really for me, the most important moment or moment when everything kind of crystallized for me was in 2016 when the CRS-8 rocket came back and landed on the drone ship for the first time. And remember being just so shocked by that because it felt so futuristic to see a rocket come back from space and you've got this little tiny boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean bobbing up and down, and then a rocket comes out of nowhere and lands on it. And it's not something where I really had expected to see. And it felt like science fiction, right? Rather than science. And, I was born just after the final Apollo missions. So I felt like I'd missed kind of this golden era of spaceflight. And that was really the point where I realized that, well, maybe the real golden era of spaceflight is ahead of us. And that this just felt like such a critical step in that whole process. And so it was at that point I really wanted to understand how SpaceX had been able to do this. And that was kind of the beginning of the journey to really learning a lot more about the company and ultimately writing a couple of books.
Can you kind of highlight for those that are unfamiliar why that moment was so significant in the commercial space industry?
Yeah, I mean, it was really so like they had landed back at the Cape the December before that. And that obviously was a huge moment. Just a few days before Christmas, it was on a return to flight launch. That was obviously a huge deal. But to make the Falcon 9 economics work, to get the performance out of the vehicle, you really needed to land the first stage downrange. And so they had already tried to land at sea several times and failed for various reasons. And so, they really had to show that was going to work. Otherwise, you were really limiting the Falcon 9's performance. And so just from that standpoint, it felt important. But really, for me, it was just almost more emotionally important because, like I said, it just felt so unreal to see that. I think that's honestly kind of a lot of people had the same feelings about the catch this past weekend with the Starship coming back to the tower. It was that same kind of sense of like you had never seen this before. A few years ago, it would have seemed unimaginable. But here, these crazy engineers and technicians in South Texas were out there pulling it off, and it was that kind of audacious thing that like I said, no one had ever done before, and these guys pulled it off, and it was really remarkable and just, as I say, inspiring.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and that's a good transition. I want us to share a video of that, but just to point out that why this is so important, like the milestone we saw this weekend with the return of the booster. I mean, I've had people that are non-space people, those that aren't attuned to what's happening in the industry, that are talking about it, and they're saying this is really cool. What's happening here? So the reach is expanding, and we're getting more public interest in what SpaceX is doing, what this is happening in the space industry. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. We're going to share a quick video of the chopsticks coming back, and we're going to see that video of the booster returning. There we go.
Sorry about that.
All good. Chills to watch that. Like you said, it's that awe-inspiring moment watching that booster return. If you don't mind, like, can you just highlight some of the implications of that? Like, why is that booster returning important? For some that don't know what the implication is for Starship, for the future of humans to Mars and other missions. Why is that booster returning so critical to the grand scheme?
Right. So, I mean, as SpaceX has shown with the Falcon 9, reuse is the key to really unlocking a rapid launch cadence. And so SpaceX knew that they needed to get these boosters back. And a few years ago, Elon made the decision, like when you land a rocket back when you land a rocket, you have this enormous mass penalty, right? You have fuel that you have to use to bring it back. And then you also have like extra stuff like landing legs, which are pretty big and pretty heavy, and the actuators to drive it. And so, they were thinking, and the other thing too is like, when a rocket lands at sea or even on land, you've got a couple of days to safe it, transport it, and refurbish it. And so ideally is if you could bring the rocket right back to the launch site and put it back on the launch stand, um, which SpaceX did in a matter of hours, you eliminate the mass penalty for the landing legs. You eliminate the transport time and handling time and really cut that down. And so it was just a win-win-win. The only real question is whether or not they could actually do it. And so the fact that on their first attempts, they nailed it. I mean, that's just super impressive.
Absolutely. 100%. Very impressive. And, when I talk to people about the space industry and about SpaceX specifically and what it is that they're doing, trying to explain the reusability piece and why that's so crucial to making SpaceX successful, making the space industry as whole. We're trying to get humans to Mars. And so I try to give the example of like, you wouldn't build a, $20 million car and then you drive it and then that's it. You're going to throw it in the ocean. No, you're going to drive that car as many times as you can. And that's the same concept here with SpaceX, trying to make those rockets reusable. And like you said, to see the return of the booster on the first try, I mean, that's a crazy monumental feat. So it's pretty incredible to witness that. But we've alluded to it a little bit. So I'm curious, obviously you cover Elon, you cover SpaceX, you cover the industry as the whole. What do you think about these billionaires that are running these space companies? Is it positively or maybe negatively impacting the effect of space on the public interest?
So I think on one hand, you have to say that it's an enormous positive because if you take SpaceX out of the equation and if you take Blue Origin out of the equation, you've got a lot of companies that are struggling to be successful, and it's not clear whether this commercial space pathway works. So the billionaires are absolutely essential, and their vision I think is very important to driving NASA and SpaceX or NASA forward and the U.S. spaceflight enterprise forward. On the other hand, I think from a public perception standpoint, it's really concerning. I've had discussions with a lot of industry folks over the years about the public perception of commercial space. Let's go back a couple of years to when Jeff Bezos sued over the Human Landing System contract, and Blue Origin was lobbying hard for their NASA to award a second contract. And there was the language from people like Bernie Sanders in Congress, and I think other people shared this, that he called it the Bezos bailout, that bill. Right. And so Jeff Bezos had a pretty negative perception among some liberal members of Congress. And, Elon Musk has gotten much more politically active in the last year. And he has turned off a lot of Democrats in Congress and in potential, Kamala wins certainly in the White House. And so this has consequences. And I think it's, and then Richard Branson sort of flying into space a few years ago this summer, and then Jeff Bezos following him a few weeks later. I mean, all of this is like pushing forward the narrative that space is a play area for billionaires. It doesn't help people on the ground at all. Only the rich go to space, and they're joy rides. And why are we wasting our money there when the money really needs to be spent here on Earth to benefit humanity? And of course, the real narrative is not that, right? Like space is benefiting people. The banking transactions you do, the directions on your phone, increasingly your communications are all driven by space and satellites, and that the transparency in wartime from optical and SAR satellites in Ukraine, just all of these benefits we're deriving from space. So I think it's really difficult. And that's why I'm like very gratified to see people like Jared Isaacman be the first private, really true private astronauts. Because he gets it, right. He's a billionaire, but he's trying to bring average people into space. He's trying to bring people along for the ride. And so I think we need more of that in this industry. And I do think there's a real perception problem. And Elon on one hand is essential, like SpaceX is essential to driving forward spaceflight, but on the
Yeah.
other, now his involvement and partisanship really casts a pall, I think, over the space industry among large segments of the U.S. population and abroad. And so it's going to be a tricky thing to navigate, because I think commercial space is definitely the way forward, but it has to be seen as benefiting a majority of people on Earth, not just a select few.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You make a good point there. There is a small group of these billionaires that are getting that cowboy billionaire kind of stereotype, and that they're just feeding their own passions and maybe their own interests.
It's not even a stereotype. I mean, Jeff Bezos goes to a spaceport in West Texas wearing cowboy boots and a hat, and then
one is not a stereotype. That is
the very first space flight he goes on is his spacecraft's very first human space flight he's on.
Right.
And Elon is wearing cowboy hats and boots now. So I mean, maybe it's not a stereotype.
It's the uniform of Texas. We dress the part. No, I hear you 100%. There's that phrase, like, what all press is good press. Like, even if they are personifying this stereotype of these cowboy billionaires, I mean, they're still doing work that is going to help the space industry as a whole, humanity, like you're saying, with the GPS and banking transactions. I mean, the work that they're doing in the space industry, although they're have a self-serving interest and they want to go to space just like all of us do. If I were a billionaire, I'd probably send myself up too. But at the same time, it's twofold. They're still helping the industry, and they're making commercialization more accessible for all of those that want to reach space. So can we talk a little bit about the space industry as a whole, some of the other players that are in the commercial space industry, not just SpaceX, but you touched on Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin and Branson with Virgin Galactic. Kind of tell us a little bit about what is happening in the commercial space industry as a whole.
Well, one of the benefits of SpaceX's success circa 2010, 2012 was that it really unlocked a lot of additional venture capital funding for other entrepreneurs interested in spaceflight, people who could come along and say, I want to be the next SpaceX for this. And if you go back and look at the venture capital funding, it goes up by about 10x from 2010 to 2015, and that largely again is due, if you talk to those investors, due to the SpaceX effect. And so, we've seen a lot of expansion into low Earth orbit, into space stations, into in-space transportation, communications, and NASA critically has made this transition from a cost plus contracting as its primary basis to fixed price contracting. And so now they're buying services. And Jim Bridenstine used to always say, we want to be one of many customers. And NASA under Bill Nelson has continued. Bill Nelson, who of course was an architect of the SLS rocket, famously said before Congress, a year or two ago, cost plus contracts are a plague on the United States. So, I mean, that's quite a remarkable turnaround. The challenge, though, is for these commercial space industry companies, is for companies not named SpaceX to actually execute on their fixed price contracts. And so we see this we see lots of struggling, I think, in the commercial space station program. A lot of the CLIPS providers, these are private companies sending smaller payloads to the moon for NASA, are struggling financially. Axiom Space, which is developing spacesuits for NASA, is struggling financially. So it's a really important time for these companies to succeed and execute, and for NASA to make sure that it's there to help them succeed as much as possible. We're kind of in this perilous moment, I think, where the Artemis program could either soar or go sideways. And it's going to depend, again, on the commercial space industry's ability to execute on some of these really critical contracts.
Yeah, completely agree with you there as well. There needs to be a lot of players in this space. It can't be, just SpaceX.
That's right.
Have a lot of customers. There's obviously Boeing is in the news recently with Starliner. Can you give a little bit of thoughts on Boeing's situation and the astronauts that are currently at the International Space Station still, Boeing and Butch and Sunny?
Well, they're coming home on Crew 9, of course, the vehicle attached to the space station. But it was kind of the summer of Starliner as we got through this saga, and it was I I just remember how shocked I felt when I first heard that no, it was more likely than not that the crew was coming home on Starliner. Excuse me, on Crew Dragon rather than
Yeah.
Starliner. You know,
Hmm.
if you go back a decade ago during the formation of the Commercial Crew Program, Boeing was clearly the leader, and SpaceX was not viewed as someone who was going to be successful, and so that completely and really remarkably turned around in the last decade. You know, Boeing still is not publicly committed to Starliner since it came back from space, which I think
Hmm.
is really interesting.
Hmm.
And we're in a position now where we're kind of waiting to see what the company's next move is. They have a new CEO. They made, I think, a 10% across the board cut today in
Saw that.
employment, taking continued losses in their space division. So we're going to have to see whether Boeing commits to that vehicle or not. I think the future is still pretty unclear. And I would actually put the odds at about 50-50 that we ever see Starliner fly again.
Hmm. It's just another notch in the SpaceX hat that, like, hey, they're going to be returning on Dragon. So it just proves that SpaceX is the reliable uh, company right now, and they're going to be able to help in those situations when needed. Um, let's see. We're starting to get a couple audience questions, so I don't want to monopolize you with only mine, but want to get a couple of these that we've got from our audience members. So Joseph asks, what do you think about data servers being set up in space? Do you think that might be path forward to space commerce?
It's possible. There's a plan to put data servers in space. There's a plan to put data servers on the moon. There are interesting reasons to do it, just in terms of being outside of international control. Energy and thermal maintenance might be better in space. I think this raises kind of the larger question of, you know, what is the next frontier in, you know, commercial space? Like, how are companies going to make money in space, basically, right?
Right,
We've
right.
seen, um, you make money by serving NASA or serving the Department of Defense contracts, and then there's some money in Earth observation. Of course, SpaceX and probably OneWeb as well are making money from low Earth orbit, you know, broadband internet constellations. But what's the thing that's going to drive human activity in low Earth orbit or on the moon? Like, what's the killer industry we're seeing there? You know, the fact is we've been on the International Space Station for almost 25 years now, and it's not clear to me yet what, like, the killer financial app is. And so we really need to discover these centers of profit, because if we're only ever going to go as far as NASA and the Department of Defense foot the bill, we're just not going to go that far.
Hmm.
Um, so maybe data centers in space is certainly a possible profit driver. We'll have to see on that. But we've got to find more ways for industry to make a profitable return on space, to really drive the kind of expansion of the solar system I think everyone listening here wants to see. I mean, I think we all want to see humans settle other worlds, right?
Hmm.
And Mars is probably the best place to start that. But to do that, I mean, let's face it, the government is not going to pay, NASA is not going to pay for the settlement of Mars. That's probably going to be done by private industry. And so we've got to figure out good reasons to go there.
Right, finding new industry. Top of things that come top of mind. I mean, space mining, asteroid mining. That's one. There's a potential opportunity for business there. There's a big need right now. We're seeing it more and more with the satellites that have been launched, that they're becoming space debris. They're only lasting, call it 5 years. There's going to be an opportunity. There's going to be a need there for cleanup of space debris. So I'm not too familiar with space debris companies that have come up in the industry right now. Are you familiar with that? Do you know if there's companies right now that's their focus is trying to clean up space debris?
Yeah, probably the most prominent of them is Astroscale,
That's just
but there are other
okay.
companies that are doing, you know, have ideas for remediation as well. And right now they're kind of at the point where they're launching missions where they're testing, you know, spacecraft and their ability to fly close to other vehicles in orbit and kind of
Sure. Yeah.
reconnoiter them. And the
Uh-huh.
next step, of course, would be to try to grapple them and deorbit them. But we haven't really seen any demonstrations of that yet. But it's something that, like, the European Space Agency is very interested in.
Okay.
And to a lesser extent, the United States has shown some interest, but I think we really do need a bigger commitment to making low Earth orbit sustainable, especially given that there are now 7,000 Starlink satellites up there and many thousands of more coming, and Project Kuiper, and then Chinese mega constellations. And so we really need to be doing a better job, I think, of making sure that those orbits are kept as clear as possible.
It's unfortunate to think that it may take a tragic, catastrophic event for there to really be a focus on this. But until there's potentially a massive accident where, the space debris is colliding with, a satellite that's giving us GPS and it causes this huge disruption on Earth. Do you think it might take something like that for space debris to be a priority, either for NASA, the government, or private industry to try to solve this problem?
Unfortunately, I think it will. I mean, we had a really significant moment a couple of years ago when the Russians shot down one of their own satellites, and NASA astronauts had to shelter in place on the space station for several orbits, right, because of debris raining down through that orbit, and then being at risk of that. And the fact of the matter is, not a whole lot's changed since then. There was some condemnation by the State Department, but that was it. So I think you're right. Like, we're going to need some very serious disruptions. And my fear, of course, would be that if that happens, then it might already be too late if there's that much debris up there.
It's unfortunate. We're going to hope that, hey, we're taking a preemptive plan to try to avoid a situation like that. You mentioned the International Space Station, and we've talked about it a few times with various guests, like Rick Tumlinson, for example. And we were talking about what should we do with the International Space Station. Obviously, the technology is dated now; it's archaic. Astronauts that are there are spending half their day doing repair and maintenance, and so the plan right now is to decommission the space station and drop it into the ocean. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have potentially a better solution for how we could solve this? I mean, make a museum up orbit. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I know Rick is a very passionate advocate for trying to reuse or repurpose the space station. I think the fact of the matter is that a lot of that hardware is aging on orbit. Some of it is aging gracefully, some of it's not. And if we are going to have a future in which there are private space station operators in low Earth orbit, we really need to give them a clear lane to operate. Like, it's very hard if you're a Voyager Space or another company, Axiom, trying to raise money for commercial space stations, to raise funding if NASA is still holding out the possibility of flying the space station beyond 2030. And it's really hard for me to see long-term utility of taking the space station and putting in stashing in a higher orbit. Just the energy cost of that alone would be enormous. We're talking about probably billions of dollars to raise its orbit substantially, and then you'd have to track it, and it's just a big target to be struck by additional debris. I just think there are some problems with the plan to try and keep the station flying, or sort of, as I say, stash it in a higher orbit until it can be used decades from now. I just think it's probably time. It's going to fly for 30 plus years. That's a really amazing lifetime for space hardware. We've learned a lot, and I think it's time probably to move on. So I think NASA's decision, I kind of think they're doing the right thing.
Who right now is the next front runner? I know Axiom is working on their commercial space station, China as well, and we've got some government agencies that are working there. But who's the next front runner right now for the succession to the International Space Station? What's the next option?
Well, China has its Tiangong space station already, and that's going to continue flying well after, I think, the International Space Station retired. NASA has the Commercial LEO Destinations program, and they've funded contracts for Axiom, Voyager, Blue Origin, and Northrop. Northrop has already dropped out. They decided that it was not financially a business where they could make money. Axiom has been really struggling financially. I'm not sure Blue Origin is fully committed to the program. And Voyager has never built something like this before. They don't have a great longevity in terms of space hardware development. So each of the participants, I think, has some challenges, and so NASA is going to have a second round of contracting next year. Some other companies like VAST and potentially SpaceX are going to come on board at that point. But I think if NASA is really serious about having a commercial space stations take over in 2030 or 2031, they really need to step up their commitment to the program soon, because those companies all need help.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What's the latest on the our international partners? So obviously, the International Space Station is effort between many nations, and there's the Mir, the Russian side, Mir, and you mentioned China's already has their space station. What does the future of that international collaboration look like?
Well, it's going to morph into the Artemis Accords, and we've already seen most of the ISS partners, Russia aside, who's going their own way with China, sign
Mm-hmm.
up to be a part of the effort to go back to the moon and establish a sustainable presence there. And for now, a lot of those European partners have committed to developing modules for the Lunar Gateway.
Mm-hmm.
I know Bob Zubrin has energetically called it the Lunar Toll Booth. I'm sympathetic to that viewpoint. I do think that the Lunar Gateway probably hinders the Artemis program at this point, and that they're eliminating it, and some other things could streamline our efforts to go back to the moon and stay on the moon sustainably. And I do think the international partners would pivot to that. But basically, they've all had a generally good experience with the International Space Station partnership, and so they're interested in extending their participation outward to the moon.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, you touched on something that I wanted to discuss with you with Lunar Gateway. So, I also know about you're a fan of orbital depots. So let's touch on those. So, as a fan, what role do you think orbital fuel depots will play in facilitating long duration missions to Mars and beyond?
So I've been writing about space for a long time, and it was pretty clear that the way we were going to have a sustainable space program is that you put vehicles into space and then refueled them and used them to go to the moon, come back from the moon, go to Mars. But
Mhm.
kind of the key enabling technology was having depots or gas stations in space, if you will, where these ships could come, refuel, and not have to come back into Earth's gravity well and go back up.
Mhm.
The problem is in the 2010s, that was essentially a verboten technology in the United States, because Richard Shelby, who was from the state of Alabama, a powerful
Yeah.
senator who chaired appropriations,
Mhm.
prohibited NASA from working on depots.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's ironic that now we're in the HLS program, the Human Landing System program, and both SpaceX's Starship and Blue Origin's Blue Moon landers both are based on depot technology now. In SpaceX's case, it's propellant, it's methane storage in space. In Blue Origin, they're using hydrogen as their upper stage and in space tug fuel. So we have gone from an era where NASA was not working with depots at all now to an era where depots are essential to going back to the moon. I think that's a really healthy development, and perhaps not coincidental that Richard Shelby retired a couple of years ago.
Mhm. Yeah, I was just reading about that part in your book. So would you say that you're in favor of using Falcon 9 and Dragon with orbital depots to speed up Artemis missions as well?
Well, the problem is with Crew Dragon is it's not rated for deep space missions, and to modify it right now, you could do it, but the reality is that we probably have a deep space vehicle available in Orion. It still has to
Mhm.
have its heat shield tested. It still has to fly an Artemis 2 mission. And we have a rocket, the Space Launch System, that can get Orion out to the moon. It showed that in Artemis 1.
Mhm.
So if our goal is to start getting to the moon as quickly as possible and getting a cadence of missions going, I think it just stands to reason to continue flying um, Artemis with on SLS and Orion. Where I think we should diverge pretty quickly is scrap all of the plans to upgrade the SLS rocket. There's no need for the larger Block 1B or Block 2 boosters, especially when you have Starship clearly already an operational vehicle. New Glenn is likely to launch sometime within the next 3 to 6 months, and I think that'll get operational fairly quickly. And then you'll have two private super heavy lift vehicles that can do all of the things that you would want to do with a larger version of the SLS rocket. And the fact of the matter is, neither of the lunar landings, SpaceX's or Blue Origin's, are all dependent on the larger SLS rocket that was solely created for the Gateway, which, as we talked about a little earlier, really isn't necessary to the overall plan.
Mm-hmm.
So I think eventually we're going to see humans launching the moon on Starship or potentially on Crew Dragon. But
Mm-hmm.
if our goal is to get to the moon in the 2020s before China does, then we should probably stick with SLS Block 1 and Orion.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you specifically about Artemis, SLS. What do you see right now as some of the key successes to the program so far, and maybe what some of the setbacks or challenges are right now, and how is that going to impact getting humans back to the moon?
So I would just say, I saw we had a question about why did Shelby block depots.
Oh yeah.
The answer is that if you didn't have refueling in space, then it benefited having one big rocket, right? So the idea with SLS is that you get one big launch, but it's a powerful rocket, so you can put all of your architecture on that vehicle. If you have smaller distributed launch and depots, you just entirely don't need the SLS rocket. Um, I think the biggest success of the Artemis program is that it has kind of coalesced the nation around a goal. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
pretty good goal, right? We're going to go to the moon. We're going to learn some things. We're going to establish the fact that, yes, we can have settlements in deep space. And then that sort of sets the stage for going to Mars. I mean, if you go back before Artemis, frankly, we were constantly having food fights between the Mars Society, between the lunar advocates. So you had the moon versus Mars, and that was all you heard about and wrote about. And now, like, we actually have a pretty clear plan that I think a lot of people agree on, and it's reasonably well funded, and it survived the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And so, like, you've got the White House, you've got Congress, you've got private space, you got commercial space, you got traditional space, you've got the international partners, and you've got the advocacy community. Everyone is pretty much rowing in the same direction. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the major success of the Artemis program.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, is that there's still a lot of execution that has to happen, right? We still need Orion to demonstrate that its heat shield works. We need SpaceX to step up and fly a bunch of Starship missions to demonstrate the safety of that vehicle and demonstrate in-space refueling and demonstrate the capability to land on the moon and take off the moon, right? That's a lot. We
Mm-hmm.
need Axiom to demonstrate the safety of their spacesuits in the lunar environment. We need some communications, work to be done. And then there's just a whole lot of integration on the NASA side. So there's still, we just need to execute.
Mm-hmm.
And there has been, the execution, I think, has been slower and has been lacking, which doesn't give any confidence at all in dates for 2026. You have to even question whether a 2028 lunar landing is possible at this point.
Mm-hmm. As they say, space is hard. There's a lot of challenges. Like you said, we need to execute. But I think in general, people are chasing that nostalgic feeling of like the country has come together. We've landed, humans on the moon. We've accomplished this significant feat. It took a lot of effort from, tens of thousands of individuals to make this happen. And I think people are chasing that. And so maybe that's why there's so much excitement around Starship and Artemis program right now. So getting people interested is part of it. And of course, public interest can relate to funding and getting financial support from the government. So there's a lot of challenges there, but I think the general consensus is, hey, people are looking forward to something like this. They want to be excited about it and be proud and witness that next feat. So, we have that. That's a positive. But I see we're getting a ton of questions. So I want to make sure that I give those an opportunity. So I'm going to scroll back a little bit here. So we had a question about from Gregory, and it says, what about starting space colonies first near Earth without gravity?
Well, you got to build them. And we've already seen how challenging it was to build the International Space Station. And we're having lots of challenges with commercial space stations. And so I think the commercial space stations are the first step toward that road. And if they're super successful, then maybe we do bypass, habitats on the surface of the moon. If we get a company like VAST or someone who really takes off with building space stations and we find that to be habitable. I think what's exciting about VAST's approach is that they're looking at artificial gravity, which I think is super important long term for sustainable human presence in space. And so we'll see. I mean, it's nice I think we've got both tracks coming, and we'll just see again which can kind of execute as we go along.
Yeah, we've had other individuals on the podcast, including Kirsten Whittingham from Max Space and the expandable space habitats, and we were talking about how that could be a potential avenue. And we've heard from Michael at Gravitics and their use of artificial gravity. So there's a couple of routes here how we could skip, like you said, lunar surface habitats, and maybe we're doing something where they're actually in space. So there's a lot of excitement there. I see we have a question from Dan. I love this question. Would you go to the moon as a reporter?
I'd love to go to the moon. But I'll tell you, it's it's a lot of work. Like even even the orbital missions that with the private astronauts have gone, and they've put in a lot of training.
Mm-hmm.
To go to the moon obviously would be a huge step forward. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm 51. I'm hoping, in my 70s maybe there's a lunar hotel that I can book a weekend stay on. I'm not sure I would want to go all the way to Mars. That's a pretty long trip. But the moon, absolutely. Yeah.
Agreed. I'm with you on that one. And you're right. I mean, even for those suborbital flights, I mean, those astronauts that are going the commercial route, it's not just I buy a ticket and I hop on and I'm there. Like there is a lot of training involved. They are preparing for all of the potential things that could happen while they're in space. So it's more than just buying a ticket. But yeah, if given the opportunity, would still probably take it. I see we have a question here. This question is, can Eric give us some insight to the FAA Part 450 license fiasco with SpaceX? Wasn't the point of 450 to accelerate development?
So without getting too deep into the weeds, I think the question is like, why did the FAA take so long in awarding a license to SpaceX for Starship Flight Test 5? The reality is that the FAA is understaffed and they don't have the same level of technical expertise that you have at a company like SpaceX. And so when you're a company like SpaceX and you're trying to do all of these crazy things at a breakneck speed, the SpaceX or the FAA just is not resourced to deal with all of those requests. I mean, it's following all of these rules that it has. And yes, Part 50 was made to streamline the rules and regulations, but it's clearly not working as well as it was intended. And SpaceX keeps coming back with all of these out of the box things like, please approve us flying our rocket back and catching it with chopsticks. I mean, that's entirely novel, right? So the fact of the matter is, the reality is that the FAA was not created. The FAA's commercial space division was not created to handle a company that wants to launch 150 rockets a year and build something like Super Heavy. I mean, it was created, to handle 5 to 10 commercial launches a year. And so, Congress really needs to step up and fund it and either keep it in FAA or move it to Commerce or somewhere like that and recognize that this is a new era and paradigm of spaceflight, and we need a better regulatory environment to really allow these commercial space companies to fly.
Yeah. And to your point about you not equipped to, or wasn't planning on approving that many missions, did I see an article earlier today that SpaceX just passed 100 launches for the year 2024?
Yeah, they launched 2 more rockets last night. So they're up to 101, I think, this year.
Well, there we go, 101. Okay, we've got another question here. You posted on X yesterday. It was the first time the AIAA had ever stated reusability is the future of launch. What's the significance of that to the industry?
Well, I think it's just the AIAA is kind of the old guard, engineering organization in spaceflight, very traditionally heavily funded by the private, the traditional space contractors. And so to kind of come out equivocally and say that like reusability is the future of launch, like, I mean, everyone on this stream I think says, well, duh. I mean, it's been pretty clear for several years that when SpaceX started flying the Falcon 9 5 and then 10 times that this was the future. But it's just nice to sort of see that this is accepted now by everyone, and it's just gone completely mainstream.
Okay, another question about something that was posted on X. What do you think about Elon saying they plan to also catch the Starship in the future on X?
I mean, I think that's essentially the plan. Eventually, the plan. I don't think it's going to happen right away. I think they're going to try some vertical landings of Starships, perhaps somewhere on some islands in the Pacific, trying to chase that down right now, actually. But yeah, I mean, eventually the plan is to get Starships and boosters back and stack them again, and that will be, Elon said yesterday or today in response to something I said on X that basically they were going to try to have full stack reusability next year. I think that's super ambitious. It's a green lights to Malibu timeline with Elon, but that is the plan, and they will get there. And I think that, again, the sort of the significance of yesterday's catch was that just shows that they are on track to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Shifting gears a little bit, so we've obviously talked a lot about SpaceX, but there's two questions here about Europa mission. So can you tell us about upcoming plans for that, as well as what are the chances there being life in the underground ocean?
So yeah, the Europa Clipper launched on Monday, and it was
Yeah.
fantastic. This is the coolest science mission I think that's going to launch in my lifetime, because it's going to a completely unknown world, Europa, which has the largest ocean in the solar system. It's a warm ocean. It has conditions similar to we see with the deep sea smokers on Earth, where life has been found,
Mm-hmm.
observed. And so yeah, the thinking is there's probably potentially life on Europa. And this mission is likely not going to detect that life, but it will tell us a lot about the habitability of the ocean, the this large ocean beneath the icy surface on Europa. I mean, the reality is that most of the great mysteries about the solar system were solved in the 1970s and 80s with the Voyager missions, the Viking missions. I mean, we really understood that Mars, there were not little green men running around on Mars, and we saw that Venus was this kind of hell planet, and the gas giants, of course, were inhabited, and we got some basic information around the outer planet moons. But I kind of consider Europa to be the last great undiscovered territory in the solar system. So the fact that we're going there with a dedicated mission is super exciting. Now the problem is we just got to wait 6 years to get the data back.
Right, exactly. That brings me to the next question. So Europa mission is very exciting, but won't arrive until 2030. Do you think we will have humans on Mars or the moon before that?
Not on Mars, sorry. I'll be thrilled if we get humans to Mars in the 2030s, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not what your audience wants to hear, but I think that's realistic. On the moon, hopefully, it'll be close.
Yeah. Isn't that what Elon has said his timeline is, 2030s for Starship launch?
I think he said 2030, something like that. I don't know. I love Elon, but he puts out lots of timelines, and I will be very surprised and thrilled if we have a human launch from Earth inside a Starship by 2030.
Mm-hmm. What do we call it? Must time? Is that right?
Must time, yeah. In the book, I call it the green lights to Malibu schedule. So.
Yeah. That's funny. Let's see. Well, there's another question here about Europa. So, given your experience covering space, do you see parallels between challenges faced by Europa Clipper and those encountered by other deep space missions?
Yeah, of course. I mean, all of these 6 missions, especially going to the outer planets, face the problem of how do you get power, because you're much further from the sun. And so Europa Clipper has these massive solar panels to power the spacecraft. There's a limited availability of nuclear power plants, basically, that we can put on spacecraft, RTGs. So they opted for solar power with Clipper. And then the other unique challenge, or the huge challenge with Clipper, is that it's very close to Jupiter. So it's just bathed in this intense radiation from the planet's surface. And so the spacecraft really can't be in orbit around Europa. You kind of need it to swoop in and then spend a lot of time outside of that environment. So that's why it's called the Clipper, and it makes flybys rather than being an orbiter.
Mm-hmm. So we've had an opportunity to interview. I've had an opportunity to interview a few other individuals on the podcast, including a couple astrobiologists, and we've talked about where there might be signs of life, about potential on Enceladus, Titan. There's a few others. So what about Jupiter's moon Europa is more significant, or why is that the focus of this mission versus other locations?
So there's a lot of excitement about Enceladus, right?
Mm-hmm.
This small moon around Saturn, and I get it because we've actually observed plumes from the ocean below Enceladus. The concern I have is that the oceanic environment in Enceladus is pretty young. So we're talking like tens of millions of years on the order. I don't have it exactly, but that doesn't leave a particularly long time for life to have developed. on Enceladus. Whereas Europa, the environment is more like billions of years old. So it's been around much longer. And so you would think that the odds or potential for life to develop there is greater. But I totally get the excitement about Enceladus. And Titan is fascinating too. It's the only world where you could walk on the planet theoretically without a spacesuit and not have your skin boil away, because the atmosphere is not that dissimilar to Earth, and it's cold, but it's got lakes of methane, which is pretty wild. And actually it's super exciting because we're going to send a Dragonfly mission, to Titan later this decade. And so in the 2030s, hopefully we'll be flying a small spacecraft above the surface of Titan, and sending back all kinds of cool data information. And it is theoretically possible that some exotic life forms could exist in those methane lakes on Titan. We just have no idea.
Hopefully we're going to find out more in our lifetime. I see we've got a couple Enceladus fans. They're giving their support there. We've talked a lot about SpaceX. We've talked about other commercial space industry and other companies within industry. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Blue Origin, who is working on the lunar lander. So when we get humans back to the moon, Blue Origin is focusing on their lunar lander. Can you give us an update on that and what your thoughts are with, seeing that mission through?
Well, Blue Origin for a long time has moved very slowly. And they got a new CEO almost a year ago, Dave Limp, who came from Amazon, and replaced the CEO, a guy named Bob Smith, who I think really did a pretty terrible job there. But Dave Limp has come in with a mandate from Jeff Bezos to act with more urgency. And I think that's desperately needed. And I know he's really put in some reforms there and is trying to turn that company. And they're pressing very hard toward the first launch of New Glenn, which hopefully will happen this year. They're still targeting November, but obviously putting a big rocket like that together and launching it first time is a real challenge. So they're definitely a company to watch, and they have good people working on their lunar team. They have a smaller Blue Moon Mark I lander that they're working on and potentially could launch next year in 2026. And then they are, in addition to SpaceX's Starship, the second contracted lunar lander for NASA. So it'd be great to see them make progress. And again, their in-space architecture ultimately is fully reusable, like SpaceX's is. So it's exciting to see that that's the future that we're tracking toward, is this in-space flight reusability, and that really is the bedrock for a sustainable and long-term presence in space for humans.
Yeah, the potential there is very exciting. I see we have another question. This is from Carlos, and the question is, will humans be able to invent a kind of technology that manipulates physical, biological, and chemical energies planetary to cope with storms, hurricanes, or cyclones before going to Mars to face dust storms?
I have no idea. I really don't. It's beyond my scope of expertise. I would think not, but we'll see.
That would be pretty cool. Let's see. And there's one other question there. Wanted to touch on the lunar gateway again. So we talked a little bit about the depots, but would you pick orbital depots over the lunar gateway?
100%. And NASA has talked about the utility of having Gateway be as a storage spot for depots. But honestly, if you're going to have depots, the place to do it is in low Earth orbit, because just from a Delta V standpoint, it's much better to stage missions to Mars from low Earth orbit than it is from lunar orbit.
Okay. Well, I know we're almost at time, so I want to finish our conversation with something exciting. So there's a lot to be excited about, and there's a lot to be thrilled and watching as we're seeing these new things happening, specifically like with SpaceX. But my last question to you, Budi, what are you most excited about?
Just the potential of where we could be going. Everyone kind of looked back at the 1960s as the golden age of spaceflight, right, with the Apollo missions and all of that excitement. But the reality is we are set up now to do so many great things in space, from communication to exploration to potentially settlement. I mean, the reality is that before this moment, we've never had any kind of a credible plan for human settlement in space. And now we've got NASA fully on board with taking some steps to establish settlements on the lunar surface. Long-term settlements, potentially permanent settlements. It's not clear. But then with SpaceX and Starship, you have the potential for space settlement on the surface of Mars. And with the Starlink program, frankly, you have the ability to fund it. SpaceX could almost self-fund a settlement program for Mars. And so that's very exciting to me. Like, we have, in human history, we've never had that potential at all. We sent 12 people to the moon during the Apollo program. And, I think, we could send dozens to the moon on a single Starship within the next decade. So that's pretty exciting about the potential of what's ahead of us.
Well, I know I said that was my last question, but of course I'm going to have one more. So thinking about your next book, you've just released your second one. Are you starting to brainstorm and think about, hey, what am I going to cover in my third? Or are you waiting for, after the obviously success right now with the return of the booster, you're like, hey, I know something great is on the horizon. That's what I'm going to focus on for book 3.
Well, I'm trying to take a break, but I do have a couple ideas, and I'm asked all the time if I'm going to write a book about Starship, kind of a third part of a trilogy. And I think I would like to do that, but I do think that book is well into the future, because we really don't know where the Starship program is going. And I want to have a sense of do they get the full reusability? How much do they actually launch the vehicle? Do we actually put humans on Mars? And then I think you could start to write a really definitive book on this latest chapter of the life in SpaceX.
Excellent. It's going in my pre-order list. I'm going to have it ready to deliver to the Kindle as soon as it comes out. I can't wait to see what you write next. Well, Eric, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for speaking with me and answering all the questions I threw your way. You handled it like a champ.
Well, thanks very much, Ashton, and thanks everyone for the great questions.
Well, it's a pleasure chatting with you. I want to say a quick thank you to our friends at Liftport, Michael and Leah. Thank you, Michael Stoltz, our PR director. Thank you, James Burke, our executive director. It was a great episode. It was, again, a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you, audience, for all of your questions. You were really engaged today. Love all the feedback that you're giving us. So we're going to end today's episode the way we always do. And Eric will know this as well.